Hey YouTube. I just wanted to do a quick response to tooltime9901 and his recent two videos discussing the topic of human nature. Um, what seems to me to be important about uh, talking about human nature is not the question of whether or not human nature is good or bad or anything like that, but actually the question ought to be, rather than talking about human nature, we ought to talk about how we talk about human nature. I'm interested in the meta discourse, first and foremost, and I'll get to the reasons on that in a minute. But first, I want to make the observation that we only really seem to talk about human nature when, well, there are two circumstances. We talk about human nature with respect to tragedy happening. That seems to be you know, a common place when some crazy, horrible person does something that's crazy and horrible. We'll talk about human nature. And the other time that we tend to talk about human nature is in justifying authority and authoritarian structures within our society. We human beings are wretched and horrible, and therefore we need to have constraints put on us and blah 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 blah. These two also are interlinked, aren't they? It's when some horrible tragedy strikes, that's when we begin to see authoritarian tendencies come out in society, I think. If we think of Columbine, for instance, there was sort of an attempted rash of censorship that followed that. Um, so yeah, these two realms of where we talk about human nature are interlinked. Now, this all makes human nature a very difficult thing to talk about. Um, in fact, if you really look at the issue, I don't think that there's any reason at all to moralize the question of human nature. People seem to either talk about why human nature is horrible or why human nature is okay or not that bad or something like that. Um, you don't. First of all, you don't see people talking about how awesome human nature is. That's interesting in and of itself. But it seems to me that there's virtually no reason to attach any sort of moral content to the idea of human nature, and it seems like a terrible place to start a conversation. Actually, uh, nobody really goes about the business of defining what they mean by human nature. Nobody goes about the serious business of looking at history and looking at different social structures and how humans behave within them and how that changes over time. And comparing that with biological factors of our evolution, um, what seems to be necessary given our genetics and given our neurology and such. And in fact, we don't really know that much about enough about neurology to really begin that conversation. I think the most noble and landmarked um, uh, attempt I've ever seen at talking about human nature in amoral terms is probably Chomsky in linguistics. Um, and you know, please feel free to research that. But I'd point you to the Chomsky Foucault debate on specifically the subject of human nature. And though I tend more towards Foucault's positions, I think Chomsky's conception of human nature and how he talks about it, as structures of information within the mind, blah blah blah. It's not a moral conversation. That's what's important, and I think that that's what's that's the kind of conversation. Um, that's what a serious conversation about human nature would look like. I think I don't. I'm not very impressed when people say, human nature is this awful thing, because, by what standard do you measure that, and what, what evidence could you give to support that thesis? It seems like just a fallback to rationalizing tragedy and power structures. Um, so yeah, that's sort of my opinion on the issue of human nature. The other thing too is that by moralizing human nature, we're already in a religious conversation, um, and I think tooltime 9901, Mr. Time, I guess. I think he started to point to this. By taking it for granted that human nature is a horrible thing, we're already talking about the fall of Adam in a secularized way. These are ideas that are left over, or that we import from our religious traditions. I don't think that these are ideas that can actually stand up to scrutiny. Um, I also don't necessarily see uh, what the methodology would look like to give any analysis of human nature, because any statements that such a study would be able to make would be restricted to the society within which the study occurred, wouldn't they? If you were to place somebody in a radically different environment, um, you know, how would human nature be redefined in a different environment? And I think perhaps the most compelling argument about this is anarchist Catalonia in between 1936 and 1939, and and I'm mentioning this for a particular reason, to segue into something. Um, um, yeah, I think people typically make the claim that if people operate based on free associations rather than sort of economic relations of egalitarian relations of production, et cetera, et cetera. If people take on a more egalitarian framework, nobody will do anything. Nobody will work. Our work ethic comes from these power structures and their interrelations. But again, if you look at Catalonia in that time period, you'll see that production actually went up rather than went down. And you can sort of see why. Everybody feels like they have a stake in their society in that kind of situation. I don't want to talk too much about it because I feel like it would entail laying out a history of exactly what happened. But I encourage people who are so convinced of the horror of human nature to please look into that. And the reason what I wanted to segue into was I wanted to leave you guys with what I think is the most compelling argument I've ever seen about human nature, actually. And it's a passage from Emma Goldman, who was instrumental in the aforementioned events in Catalonia. She was an anarchist writer, and I think she writes beautifully about human nature. And she's responding to the claim that human nature wouldn't allow for an anarchist society. And her response, I think, is illuminating, and I think it's important, and I think it's beautiful. And I only drop a thinker in here in response to Mr. 9901, referencing Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau as well. I'd like to drop her name into it because I think her argument here is beautiful. She says, "Poor human nature, what horrible crimes have been committed in thy name, Every fool, from king to policeman, from flat-headed parson to the visionless dabbler in science, presumes to speak authoritatively of human nature. The greater the mental charlatan, the more definite his insistence on the wickedness and weakness of human nature. Yet how can anyone speak of it today, with every soul in a prison, every heart fettered, wounded, and maimed? John Burroughs has stated that experimental study of animals in captivity is absolutely useless. Their character, their habits, their appetites undergo a complete transformation when torn from their soil in field and forest. With human nature caged in a narrow space, whipped daily into submission, how can we speak of its potentialities? Freedom, expansion, opportunity, and above all, peace and repose alone can teach us the real dominant factors of human nature and all of its wonderful possibilities. Yeah, that passage really moved me when I read it for the first time, and I would highly recommend anybody to look through Emma Goldman's work. And yeah, please comment and subscribe, and have a good day.